Good afternoonish, I think. Yeah, good afternoon, guys. I hope that you have brought your thinking hats today. Of course you have, because you're Oxford students. But I hope that you come open-minded to consider what the clues might be for God's existence. My own journey, I'll explain a little bit later, my own journey was arriving at university as a philosophy student and being interested in big questions, but not being a Christian believer. And gradually through asking big questions, through thinking through evidence, through thinking through arguments, that opened the door for me to thinking about faith. I didn't think faith was credible before I started to look at it through the lens of philosophy. And surprisingly, because a lot of people do philosophy and they find faith can fall apart, I actually found faith stood up to questions. And I'd be very willing to share more about that. But I'm going to share with you now 6 reasons or 6 clues that I think, like a good detective, we could pay attention to if we were wanting to think about where God might be or where God might be revealed or whether God is. That is the fundamental question I want to put before you this afternoon. Do you think that God is real? Do you think it's possible that God is real? And if so, what kind of God might be real? And how does the kind of God who might be real or might not be real impact whether or not we're willing to consider that being's existence? I'm going to talk through these 6 areas. I will go quite fast at some points. I've got a video clip to show you, which will give you a little bit of a breather. But I'm going to talk through these areas, and you will notice that these are not the typical highly abstract, just simply abstract reasons for God. Because I do believe that as you and I consider the question of God, we are not considering an object like a chair or a projector or a spoon. We're considering a being who potentially has personhood, who is a person, an agent, who can do things and interact with us in personal ways. And so our appraisal of such a being needs to take into account a slightly wider picture of information and evidence, the personal dimension, so the possibility of a testimony or a story of somebody meeting that God, or even maybe things that come more from within, the idea of an unmet desire in human beings, or the longings of our imagination, as well as the classical evidential lines of reasoning that are also important. So I'm basically saying, let's be open-minded to different sources of evidence that come from different places. First one is this. Fine-tuning. What I mean by this is that the finely tuned laws of the universe are best explained through a powerful and intelligent creator. Here are some things that are more likely to happen or less likely to happen than winning the lottery. You have a 1 in 1 million chance of being struck by lightning in your lifetime. You have a 1 in 112 million chance of being killed by a vending machine. You have a 1 in 4.4 million chance of dying from being left-handed and using a right-handed product incorrectly. These are very unlikely things. And in the same way, winning the lottery is a very, very unlikely thing. Now imagine you knew somebody and they won the lottery one week. You'd be like, wow, that's amazing. Why did they tell me? That's apparently the thing you do. You don't tell anybody you win the lottery. But maybe they do. And then they win it again and again and again and again and again and again. Over and over they win it. What would you think? Or imagine you see a card game and the highest sort of set of cards you can play in, say, poker is the royal flush. Imagine you see somebody winning a card game by playing a royal flush 42 times in a row. Imagine you see that. What would you say if you saw somebody winning the lottery over and over again and you saw somebody winning a poker game over and over again with a very unlikely card combination? What would you say? It's rigged. It's cheating. There's something else going on here. Absolutely right. Watch this video because I think it shows that the fine-tuning of the universe presents us with a very similar choice.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly, or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life-prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely.
If something looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, swims like a duck, tastes like a duck, sorry if that was too far, then it's a principle of credulity, a basic principle of knowledge, that we ought to believe that things are as they seem to be until we have evidence that we're mistaken. This is a principle of knowledge that Richard Swinburne, professor of philosophy here at Oxford for many years, described. And therefore, if everybody agrees, if there's almost universal agreement that it really does look like the universe was designed for life, then maybe that allows us to posit the following argument. We ought to believe that things are as they seem to be until we have evidence that we are mistaken. The fine-tuning of the Big Bang, of the universe, the cosmos, seems like it is designed. And therefore, in the absence of sufficient counter-evidence, we should believe that the fine-tuning is designed. Food for thought, isn't it? What's the next reason I'm going to put forward? Well, the next reason is ethics. Objective values, objective right and wrong, are best explained and most satisfyingly grounded in theism. And by the way, as I describe these different clues, I don't want to make anybody feel like they're being backed up and they have to believe in God. Instead, I offer them as clues and invitations for you to reflect on. They were things that were helpful for me in my journey, and I think that sometimes we lose an openness to really reflecting when we get into the combative kind of war of the worldviews kind of thing. I want to invite you to consider these reasons, some of which may be persuasive to you, others might not be. I think that's often down to personality, but I'd be very willing to have critical questions and objections later on, but I offer them to you in an open-handed way as things that have helped me, rather than trying to start a fight or play a kind of intellectual tennis or chess game. So ethics, right and wrong. Think about the development of civil rights. It was 6 decades ago that Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. It was a call for the end of racial discrimination in the United States. Think about then how important it was and how significant it was when Barack Obama was voted, regardless of your politics, when he was voted as President of the United States. It certainly indicated that America had been on an extraordinary journey in its treatment of people, of black people, especially when you look around the globe. And I think we've seen this sort of, in some areas, this development of moral conscience and moral progress in different areas. For example, in slavery, in all sorts of re-evaluation of the status of women having the vote, women having the right to lead and to do things in past centuries that just weren't possible. And sometimes reformers, moral reformers like Luther King, talked about how there can be a moral responsibility sometimes to disobey the laws of a society, because there is this sense that there's a moral law or obligations which are bigger than just the laws that a country make. And we saw in the case of the Nuremberg war trials and the Nazis how actually even though a state passes laws, that doesn't make those laws moral laws. And it might be actually we reflect and we say maybe there are shared cultural values. Yes, of course, we do different things in different countries. Some places you pay a dowry, some places you don't. Some places we believe that some things are polite and honourable, and other places we don't think they are. Of course, that's right, but all cultures around the world seem to prefer peace and love versus revenge, murder and violence. All cultures around the world and human beings seem to come to a shared moral view that it's wrong to torture innocent people for fun. There are shared values even while we acknowledge that there are some differences in application. And we also believe in this idea of moral progress and the idea of moving from here to here, closer perhaps to something that is better, more true, more real, or more virtuous. So there's the idea of moral progress, there's the idea of shared values. And what we're really asking here then in this clue of ethics is, what's a good explanation for these shared values? And does this point away from or towards the existence of God? And I'm going to offer you now a reflection based on one of the most important things in the universe, Percy Pigs. My impression is that when you ask somebody to do something for you, when we talk about morality and obligations, you ask that person to do something, and that is related to the relationship strength that you have with them. How is this connected to morality? Well, one of the ways that moral philosophers have been talking about what moral rightness and wrongness is in talking in terms of duties or obligations. This is what we might call the Kantian approach to ethics. And it's been helpful in the last few years to see how obligations or duties can be potentially an important source, an important grounding for our sense of what the right thing to do and what the wrong thing to do is. I want to say this, is that what we're searching for here, when we think back to these shared values and these cross-cultural values that we have, and this idea of moral progress, we're talking about trying to search for a duty or an obligation that has the power to do this around the globe, simultaneously, across thousands of years of human history. How can these obligations be created? So let's just consider obligations for a moment in the light of Percy Pig sweets. If I asked somebody in the audience here that I'd never met before to give me some sweeties or to give me some Percy Pigs, they might, out of the kindness of their heart, say, yeah, all right then, and or dig into their pocket and produce some Haribo. I'd be delighted. It's not necessarily a plea, but I'm just stating a fact that you perhaps when you don't know somebody so well, a request like that has less power. This is my wife holding our daughter. I've been married to my wife for 17 years, and we know each other really well, and we love each other very much. Now, if I said to my wife, darling, maybe the trivial idea of sweets sort of makes a mockery of it, but if I said to her, look, there's this thing I really need. Could you get it for me? Could you help me with it? She would drop everything at that moment to help me. She would be much more likely to hand over the sweets as well. perhaps less likely maybe, but she would be more likely because of the depth of relationship that I have with her. And so deeper relationships have the power to create stronger duties and obligations. Do you see where I'm going? Is it not at least reasonable to say that if we're searching for an explanation for cross-cultural moral obligations, for cross-cultural moral duties, for rightness and wrongness, isn't it not at least reasonable to talk about the idea of a God who has infinite relational possibility, who can simultaneously be the grounding for right and wrong, for rightness, and can be the one who effects and creates those obligations through his very presence in the world simultaneously with people? It's a fascinating thought, I think. I hope you find it interesting. Okay, moving on to some slightly less abstract ways of reflecting on this. Imagination. I think patterns in human imagination can point towards God. I'm going to be briefer here, but I think stories often contain a journey towards a redemptive answer. One screenwriter, Brian Godawa, says this: movie storytelling is at its center about redemption, which he defines as the recovery of something lost or the attainment of something needed. Good stories narrate the events surrounding characters who overcome obstacles to achieve some goal and who in the process are confronted with a personal need for change. Movies may be about story, but these stories are finally, centrally and crucially, primarily, mostly about redemption. In other words, our stories are full of people searching for something that they've lost. Well, why would that point towards God? Well, there are some features in story alongside the hero's redemptive journey, like the nature of the hero and the unexpected rescue. The idea of sacrificial saviour figures, creation mythologies, hidden knowledge, cosmic battles between good and evil that are all part of the imaginative landscape that human beings create. And these ideas, the sacrificial saviour, the nature of the hero, the unexpected rescue, the creation stories, the hidden knowledge, the cosmic battles, these are all mirrored in the Christian story that's revealed in Scripture. This is exactly what we would find if human beings were somehow remembering or re-echoing through their imagination these sorts of things. And so when we read or learn of the great stories, perhaps Harry Potter or The Hobbit or Star Wars or the other great stories, and when we see heroes who battle to survive, we see heroes that reflect godlike capabilities and sacrificial capabilities, human-like characteristics. Are we in some way hearing the echoes in our imagination of the hero that we're searching for that maybe is provided for by God? And I wonder, perhaps, whether the unexpected nature of story itself, the unexpected rescue that we often see in stories, something that Tolkien called the eucatastrophe, the unexpected good calamity, is this another echo that we see alongside the hero, alongside the cosmic battle, alongside the sacrificial saviour characters? Is the unexpected rescue turnaround moment that is in so many of our stories, is this also part of an echo of the gospel and of the Christian faith, and of perhaps a clue to God, therefore? Tolkien thought so. This is what he wrote in a letter 142, if you want the reference. He said, "The birth of Christ is the good catastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the good catastrophe of the story of God becoming man in Jesus." In other words, it seemed like it was all going wrong in human history, and then God turned up in Jesus. And then it seemed like everything had gone wrong in Jesus' story because he was being killed on the cross. But the resurrection was the turnaround of that story too. And it seems like in all of our imaginative stories, there are these moments where everything seems like it's over and done and finished. And we are most satisfied by stories that actually echo this gospel shape. Okay, last three reasons. Separate from our imagination is this idea that we have an unmet desire as human beings. That there's a longing in human beings that could point towards God. That we long for success. We long for wealth. We long for health. It's something that will become more and more apparent to you as you get older. We want to be healthy. And we long for experiences. Some of us long for love. The great longing of my sort of first 30 years on this earth was to find a relationship, because I thought that a romantic relationship would complete me and make me whole. And actually, I think we long in love and in career and in status and in all kinds of ways. We long for significance, we long to be known, we long to be seen. And writers like Lewis have reflected that there's this desire in human beings that even though these things are good and relationships are good and community's good and work is good and achievement is good in its right place, actually we still find inside ourselves a desire for something more that this world can't satisfy. Not saying these things are bad, but just saying they can't quite meet a hunger in us to be seen, to be known, to be valued. Lewis says this: if I find inside myself this desire that this world cannot satisfy, then the most probable explanation is I was made for another world. Okay, fifth reason, Jesus. I think we should be open to the idea that there could be a clue for God in him coming to us as Jesus. Very sceptical philosopher, perhaps the godfather of atheism of the last 50 years, was a guy called Anthony Flew, and he said this: no other religion offers anything like the combination of the charismatic figure of Jesus and a first-class intellectual like St. Paul. If you're wanting God or omnipotence to set up a religion, it seems to me that this is the one to beat. Flew is right. One person who stands out in 60 billion is worth a second look. H.G. Wells called Jesus the most dominant figure in human history. And yet we have no record of his date of birth as such, yet the world's chronology is linked to it. He never wrote a book, yet more books have been written about him than any other person in history, and the output of those books is accelerating even now at this very moment. The nearest thing that we have to his bibliography has now been translated into over 2,000 different languages. He never painted a picture, composed any poetry or music, and yet nobody's life and teaching and behaviour and actions have generated more works of art, more books, more literature, more universities, more scholarship or other art forms than anyone else. He never raised an army, and yet millions of people have laid down their lives peacefully in his service. And every year thousands more do so. His public teaching lasted for just 3 years. And yet, as astonishing as this summary of his life is, his followers now constitute the largest religious grouping that the world has ever known or seen. Purpose-built satellites beam his message, sometimes, around the world, into people's homes and onto their radios in their cars. And it all raises the question, who was he? We've got some giveaway Gospels for you at the back here, but here are a few verses you might like to take a note of and look up. The giveaway Gospels look like that on the table. That's just a copy of Luke's Gospel. But in a couple of verses in Luke's Gospel, Jesus makes very clear claims that he is God. He refers to God as his Father and claims mutual knowledge with the Father in a unique way. He claims authority to forgive sins. He affirms that he is the Son of God, and he speaks of being seated at God's right hand. Make no mistake, people who heard Jesus talking about himself and his status were not confused about what he was saying. They either reacted exploring that and enthusiastically, or they tried to kill him, accusing him of blasphemy. And this raises the question, who was he? Now, C.S. Lewis has a very helpful discussion of this in his book, Mere Christianity, where he talks about, could he have been just a good teacher? Can we put him in that category? Was he unwell? Did he have a real grasp of things? And I think if you examine the sort of life that Jesus lived, the way he taught, his insights, you will find that Jesus is a very persuasive candidate for the idea that God or omnipotence might have revealed himself. In the end, Lewis concludes this: either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. We may have to acknowledge in our journey here that information about God and clues about God may not come to us in a test tube in a laboratory or in a philosophy textbook, but they may come to us through these simple records and eyewitness accounts of God come to us. Now, doesn't mean that's where God stays. He actually could meet us potentially in our hearts, but if Jesus' life really happened, if Jesus really did and said the things that the New Testament records him doing and saying, growing back people's limbs in plain sight, knowing people's secrets, exercising power over natural elements, predicting his own death and then rising from the dead, raising other people from the dead. If he really didn't said all that stuff, how can a reasonable person not say, I need to pay attention to that? That could be a strong clue for me in exploring God. The last one, testimony. And I'll come to this very briefly. My journey was that as a skeptical philosophy student, I started exploring questions about God. I went to an artificial intelligence lecture as part of a computer science course, and the professor at the end said to me, in answer to my question, which was, do you think we can make computers think like humans? He said it all depends whether you think a human being is just a complicated biomechanical machine or whether you think there's a soul or a spark or something more. And I said, that sounds like a philosophy question about what the nature of a person is. And that took me on a journey to say, well, what are the clues? What's the evidence? What's the information about God? What can I find out? And that meant I had to think through different worldviews, different perspectives, and the evidence for different perspectives. And gradually I came to a point where, like millions and millions of other people around the globe, I began to claim that my beliefs had changed about God, that I thought that Jesus was real and that he'd become a friend to me, and I was having an ongoing friendship with him. Now, different people, I think, experience God perhaps in different ways. I don't find God is overwhelming me and making me say weird things, but I find that just gently he's in my life, answering my prayers, walking with me, his presence giving me peace. So here are 6 clues then for God, for you to ponder and think about. Fine-tuning, ethics, imagination, testimony, Jesus, and unmet desire. Here are then 5 or 6 pointers, 5 pointers for what you could do next. I want to encourage you. Questions come before amazing discoveries. Don't be disheartened if you've still got loads of questions you're asking. Knowing your question is half of the journey to finding an answer. If you don't know what your question is, then it's very hard to know when you find the answer. So keep asking questions and keep pushing into what you hear. Listen carefully to the answers and ask yourself, when you hear something, what part of this might be true? Take the opportunity to read Luke's Gospel or Mark's Gospel. Read through, and as you read, or maybe you watch The Chosen, just consider the relational possibility that God might be real, and he may be more than a figment of a worldview or an idea in the sky, but he may actually be personal and real and may offer you the invitation to know him as well.